If I have a scientific case, I spend as much time as a judge will allow me in questioning the juries on what they expect and what not to expect. So there's no surprise in a case that I try and the people that I train try, that they know essentially. I mean, I can't stand in front of the jury and say, look, if I find DNA here and fingerprints there and ballistics evidence over here, you have to be circumspect. But I do talk to them about what Jim refers to as the CSI effect, which is a very, very real phenomenon. And I just,
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Cold Red. I'm Ray Carr, and with me always is Jim Fitzgerald, also called Fitz. And tonight we have a special guest that I'm going to let Jim introduce him. Jim?
Well, thanks, Ray. And you can call me Fitz, and you can also call our guest Fitz. But he goes by the name of Bill Fitzpatrick, William Fitzpatrick. He is the sitting district attorney at Onondaga County, New York. That's the Syracuse, New York area. And Bill and Ray, I think you'll confirm you are the first sitting district attorney we've ever had on Cold Red. We've had a few assistant U.S. attorneys, former, and a few assistant district attorneys, the state and local level, retired, but you are the first sitting attorney. And you've been doing this for a long time, perhaps more than you'd like to admit sometimes, as we all do. And just real quick, I want to hear a little bit more about yourself and how you got into where you are right now. But a little bit later in the episode, we're going to talk about two cases that you prosecuted both of them. I helped with the second. Both of them have to do, and it's tough to even say this, but mothers who not only abused their children, attempted to murder or murdered their children, but also murdered a few husbands. And the one I helped Bill with was known as we call it the Black Widow case, not the only one out there. But Bill Fitzpatrick, welcome to Cold Red.
Thank you. It's an honor, and thank you for that accolade about being the first DA to be on your show. That's incredible, especially with two law enforcement legends. Ray, I go by the nom de plume, the other Fitz, because of the notoriety of your co-host here. But in response to your question, let me just tell you a little bit about myself. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and I think the law enforcement DNA comes primarily from my dad, who was a New York City police officer. Like a lot of vets coming back from World War II, he signed up with NYPD. He had a great 20-year career there. He was a Legion of Honor winner, which is their highest award that they give out for valor. And he definitely put the law enforcement bug in me. He used to, probably against all kinds of department regulations, but he used to dump me and my older brother Barry, in the back of the station house if my mom was unable to care for us because of illness. Or one time, remember, she broke her wrist and she couldn't have the two little, rascals running around the house. And tremendous learning experience, both in vocabulary and in watching police officers interact. All of these guys, Italians, Irish, African Americans, Hispanics, they were all our uncles. It was, Uncle Joe, Uncle Sam, Uncle Jose. And I really was moved, and still in my memories thinking about it, of the camaraderie that these individuals had, and to watch them try to put cases together and help victims out. And I guess that stuck with me. And then the piece de resistance was when I was 11, my dad gave me a book about the Lindbergh kidnapping case. And Jim, I know you had a similar experience, as I found out in chatting with you earlier, which I find fascinating, that you were influenced by the same book. Author's name was George Waller. And, Lindbergh was a fascinating case because it was the first time in a case of that high profile that forensic evidence really came to the forefront. And then, the rest is just education. Went to school at Syracuse by accident, and met a professor who said, look, you wasting your time here. You should be in law school quickly. So they let me do it in 6 years instead of 7. And my intent was to go back to New York City and be an assistant DA there in either Brooklyn or the Bronx. But the local guy here made me an offer, and I
you couldn't refuse.
Stayed there. Offer I couldn't refuse. Stayed there for 10 years. And became the youngest homicide prosecutor in the history of the county, and went into private practice. That's a separate story. I'll explain it to you some other time. Spent 5 years in private practice, which was a good experience to become DA. It gives you a little appreciation of what the other side goes through. They're not all terrible people to some of them are very honest, ethical, hardworking defense lawyers, and there should be good, honest defense lawyers in this business. And then I ran in 91 and was successful, and I'm in my ninth term. I got a year and a half to go, and I probably will run one last time next year. But I still keep active in the courtroom, Jim and Ray. I probably try maybe at least one homicide case a year if it's a case that interests me. I'm the boss, so I get to pick. If I got DNA, six witnesses who are nuns, a couple of priests, videotape confession. Hey guys, that's my kid. No, it's some of the cases are quite complicated, but I just love doing it.
And real quick, you mentioned the book. It's simply called Kidnap, not past tense, Kidnapped by Robert Louis Stevenson, Kidnapped by George Waller. And I would suggest to anyone out there, the case is almost 100 years old, and no, Bill, neither you, me, or Ray worked the case. It
I
was
did not
before
try the
it
case.
was
No.
before our times.
Yeah.
But my father and parents always talked about the case of the century. They remember it back then, or the crime of the century, I should say, when they grew up right after, I guess, kind of during the Depression. But yeah, the forensics in there, the evidence, even some language evidence. Dr. Condon was meeting with the kidnapper in a darkened cemetery with Charles Lindbergh. And we're not going to get into it, but it is a good book out there. I always remember the book right out of college. I read the book Helter Skelter by the L.A. District
Scoliosis.
Attorney
Oh yeah.
Bugliosi, who prosecuted the Manson family. That book was highly influential to me, also into getting into law enforcement. Although I already had my criminal justice degree at Penn State when I read it. But yeah, early books can really be, leave a heavy influence on people, especially at 10 or 11 years old. When you and I separately, a few, maybe 100 miles apart, were reading this book about the Lindbergh kidnapping, my first adult book ever. So I gave a TEDx talk at Penn State about 6 years ago, and I did actually mention the book, put the cover up on my slide presentation, and say, "Hey, look, this is what influenced me." And I was trying to, impart to the young audience, as I do in Cold Red here when we have the chance. Here's what's influenced me to get into law enforcement. Ray has his own stories, and Bill, I know you shared just now with us. So, Ray, anything you want to add here at this point before we move on a little bit with Bill? There you are.
I have a question, Bill. When you first became a prosecutor, what did you think it was going to be like being a prosecutor? And over the last 5 decades, how has your understanding evolved of what a prosecutor is and what it's supposed to be like?
Yeah, great question. Great question, Ray. I'm a former president of the National DAs Association, and I used to say to my colleagues throughout the country, I have an expression. Prosecutors are one of the few professions whose members wake up every morning and try to think of ways to put themselves out of business. And that was not a mindset that I had when I started, at 23 years old as a ADA in Onondaga County, central New York. Back then it was win the case, and not unethically, but win the case and the hell with the consequences. Let's just get the victory. And as I've evolved and as my thinking has evolved, and I think nationally prosecutors have shared this transformation, is that prosecutors now are more are concerned not only with winning cases but with seeing that justice is done. For example, I have a conviction integrity unit. We're not afraid to go back and look at a case. I have a very close relationship with Barry Scheck. He's a good friend of mine, and he has on occasion called me, and I have exonerated people that were convicted based on new DNA evidence or based on other factors. And in addition to that, we're very, very active, Ray, with what I call diversionary courts, boutique courts. We want to, if someone crosses the Rubicon of violence, I'm not interested in how they got there, that they were bedwetters or mommy didn't treat them right or they weren't called by the right pronouns. I'm not interested in that. You're going to jail where you belong. But if you commit, relatively minor crimes before they escalate into serious crimes, I like a system that addresses the underlying cause of that. This is why I disagree strenuously with a lot of the so-called progressive prosecutors around the country, Philadelphia, Orlando, and a lot of other cities. Those prosecutors will say, we're not going to prosecute these crimes. Pick a list, 15. We're not going to prosecute shoplifting. That's insane. That destroys the quality of life primarily in the area that you purportedly are supposedly trying to help, the inner city. It's very difficult for drugstores, supermarkets, mom and pop stores to make a profit in the inner city when they've got to deal with thousands, in some cases, hundreds of thousands of dollars of inventory that's stolen. So I want to address the underlying problem. Why did you shoplift? Are you a mother shoplifting diapers? Well, I'm not going to lock you up, but I am going to get you into a program where you get free diapers. Are you a drug addict, stealing to sell something on a market somewhere and help your habit? I'm going to get you into drug rehabilitation and so forth and so on. And ultimately, the individual has to make a choice. Do they want to do that, or do they not want to do that? So that's the number one philosophical change. And then the other change, which is, I'm sure, of great interest to both you and Jim, is the way we approach the investigations of crimes. The immediately thing now that we do, we have a homicide, check the cameras, check the cell phones, whose cell phone is pinging off the tower. Call parole, get their lifetime ankle bracelet monitors, and find out who was on parole that was within, 100 feet of the shooting last night at 2 o'clock in the morning. And there's so many things like that. We have, for example, a crime analysis center here in Syracuse, where all they do is look at data. They look at hotspots. They look, okay, let's direct our patrols to this area of the city because we got a problem with burglary. And it's, as you guys both know, it's usually 7% of the people committing 70% of the crimes, and we try to focus on those people and lock them up. I mean, I know that makes a lot of legislators in New York nervous these days that people actually are incarcerated, but some people just don't belong to be in society until they straighten out their ways.
They violated the societal norms, and they have to spend some time in lockup
Got
or
to be
prison,
consequences. Yeah.
and get there. And I know, yeah, I know a number of both Ray and I both grew up in Philadelphia, and we or know that area very well, and we are very familiar with the DA there. And I heard a few years ago that a number of inner city preachers and ministers went to the mayor and said there are too many bad guys being let go. There are too many bad guys killing us, killing our parishioners, our congregants. And they went to the mayor and said, "You get that DA in line." And we know we don't mention criminals' names on the show, and we don't mention bad DA's names either, but we know who he is. And we said, and the mayor basically went to this DA and said, "We know you're Mr. Progressive and you're funded by people, if not outside the state, outside even the country. And but you got to start locking people up and getting them jail time because these ministers are not going to vote for you next time." The DA runs for an elected office there too. So I understand. The crime rate has gone down a bit in Philly, and it's a little bit safer. But I know he'd still rather prosecute cops than he would criminals,
Yeah,
bad guys.
you're right.
And
Sadly,
we're the
you're right.
and we're the first people here. If it's a bad cop, that includes FBI agents. Ray and I will say, lock them up. I mean, of course, innocent until proven guilty. That's with everyone. But at the same time, you see some of these prosecutors just going overboard. And all I'm telling you is, if I lived in Onondaga County, and I won't speak for Ray, but Bill, you would have my vote.
Thank you, Jim. That's great. It's funny you went from Lynn Abraham, who was
Yes,
a dear friend and one of the toughest prosecutors you'd ever meet, and then her successor had some legal difficulties. I'm sad to say, and
Seth
then
yes.
Williams. Yeah.
yeah, good guy, but crossed the threshold there. And then the current guy, who I've been on a couple of panels with, just not very impressed with. He's very impressed with himself. I assure you of that. But you're absolutely right. You're biting the nose off to spite your face, and not everything. I'm very sensitive to the issue of criminal justice and race. I can't have a suburban kid commit a burglary, get probation, and an inner city kid commit a burglary and go to state prison for 4 years. No DA is going to allow that in his or her jurisdiction. So I'm a frequent visitor to the poorer parts of town, primarily populated by people of color, and I have a good relationship with the ministers because they know I'm fair, and that's what it seems like those people in Philly were insisting on is fairness. But they want to be able to go outside. They want to be able to have a barbecue in the neighborhood without gunshots going off because somebody wore the wrong colors or because somebody looked askew at somebody. That's a fundamental right. That's why the three of us have devoted our lives to what we do.
Well, good for you, certainly in that regard. Can I just do a follow up with what Ray asked? And you sort of answered a little bit in there, but we keep hearing about, and actually I did a podcast yesterday and was asked this question, and I heard the term from other prosecutors, and there may be newer terms for it, but CSI juries. They've seen those TV show, crime scene investigators, where every case on TV, there's always DNA, fingerprints, and or surveillance videos. You kind of touched upon that, but I'm sure you've seen a transition over the years and where probably someone could be convicted in court on circumstantial evidence, on even indirect evidence. Nowadays, do you see it different in that regard with juries? Do they demand much more from law enforcement than perhaps was there before because of these TV shows and novels, et cetera?
There's no question that's a factor, Jim. I'm very lucky. I have been very successful with juries, and it comes with experience. I don't pick a jury the same way today that I did, when I started 40 years ago. But we just had a case where a guy I'm sorry I'm laughing at this. He had an illegal handgun. It was in his pants pocket, and he shot himself in the leg. And he was being obstinate. He wouldn't take any kind of plea. So I said, okay, we'll take it to trial. And you can get, in New York State, you can get 15 years for discharging an illegal firearm. And the jury acquitted him because there was no gunshot residue analysis done on his hand. And I'm like, I felt sorry for the assistant DA. He's a new kid. He's going to be an all-star someday. And he's like beating his head against the wall. And he goes, boss, did I screw up? I go, no, look, first of all, he's not contesting that the gun was in his pocket. He's just contesting that that somebody planted it there, that it went off by accident. And gunshot residue tests, as you guys probably know, have mixed results. A lot of police agencies don't even use them anymore. But there's an example, concrete example of a bad guy being, let go. He'll be back. Sadly, hopefully he doesn't kill anybody and shoots himself again in the leg. But there's a silly question. I and the juror admitted. She said, I saw this on one of the shows, probably CSI, that they swabbed his hand, and you guys didn't do that, so we voted not guilty. And blah, give me a break.
Well, if the gun was in his pocket when it went off, maybe some other part of his body should have been tested for gunshot residue. But we don't have to get any more graphic
Yeah,
than
right.
that.
Yeah,
We
I
could
wouldn't want to. I
we
wouldn't
could
want
have
to be the one giving that.
wanted to test it.
it almost appears, Bill, that when you're impaneling the jury and you're asking the questions, that maybe that needs to be a question that you
There's
ask
no
them.
if I have a scientific case, I spend as much time as a judge will allow me in questioning the juries on what they expect and what not to expect. So there's no surprise in a case that I try, and the people that I train try, that they know essentially. I mean, I can't stand in front of the jury and say, look, if I find DNA here and fingerprints there and ballistics evidence over here, you have to be circumspect. But I do talk to them about what Jim refers to as the CSI effect, which is a very, very real phenomenon. And I just, I guess we're polarized in this country. It certainly seems that way. But I just read a fascinating scholarly article about polarization of juries, that they're not talking to each other. There was this big pharmaceutical case in Florida, and some people sided with the hospitals and some people sided with big pharma. And they went out, they took a vote. 3 days later, they had the same vote, and it was all, it wasn't necessarily like Democrat, Republican, but it was just, intransigence is almost becoming a way of life, and it's beginning to affect juries. I haven't seen a drop in my conviction rate, though. We'll try maybe 70, 80 felony trials a year, and pretty steady over the course of time, win about 85% of them, which is good.
I think it's important that we don't lose sight of the fact of the impact that the media and social media and TV can have on individuals that are going to be on our juries.
Ray, you're absolutely right. Now, I'll drop a couple of names. Stephen Avery. Okay. Now, as in human events, it's difficult to reach a level of certainty. I am different than most people, probably like you two guys. I can look at something and I can say with certainty Lee Harvey Oswald killed JFK. I can say with as much certainty as I can muster, not having been intimately involved in the case, that Stephen Avery killed Teresa Hallback. The idea that
This is the
sweat,
case up in was it Wisconsin or Minnesota?
yeah, I think Wisconsin,
Yeah,
but
and there was a couple. There was one documentary made. I
there was a
think
podcast, and he became the cause du jour because he had, on a previous conviction, been wrongfully convicted. So the theory was, and with all due respect, he was just a bad guy, and no question, he was the wrong guy. He should not have been convicted of his original crime. But with Teresa Hallback, I mean, the evidence was about as good as you can get in a circumstantial case. But he became then this symbol, this martyr, and it was all a media creation. Another guy that I think falls into that category is Adnan Syed,
Yep.
who's a very
Serial.
a, a popular subject of a podcast that ignores about 90% of the evidence against him. I understand, police corruption. I understand false confessions. I understand all of that. But at some point, you have to objectively look at the case and say, Adnan Syed, he did it. And I know that's still in litigation in Maryland right now.
Yeah, that
But
was he was
to answer your question, Ray, yeah, the media can be a two-edged sword, sometimes detrimental to the effective administration of justice.
I
I think
agree.
the first podcast I ever listened to was Serial, and it was about that Adnan case in Maryland. And you could be kind of convinced. I was listening to it with my, future wife at the time. She said, "Boy, I'll tell you some questions." And I said, you can have the best brain surgeon in the world conduct brain surgery, and you can bring other brain surgeons in and look at and it's successful. The patient is completely cured, we'll say. Other brain surgeons can come in and say, you know what, I would have cut there differently, a centimeter to the left. No, I would have given this drug in advance before. And you can do the same with a police investigation. And I think that's what I kept hearing over and over in the Adnan case. But real quick, I want to get into these couple of cases. But yeah, the art and even science of jury selection. I know people and there's companies out there that's their full-time gig. They have lawyers on board. I know some have hired linguists, PhD linguists with whom I'm familiar, and their full-time goal is to go around the country and help prosecutors, but probably more likely defense attorneys, pick a jury. And they go through all kinds of biographical issues about jury members, likes, dislikes, gender, what have you. And it really has come down to definitely an art, but also I would say a science. But before we go too much further there, prosecutors have also told me, Bill, about another issue, which they're calling the false confession industrial complex. You mentioned that quickly beforehand. And now with everyone being Mirandized, that's been going on for 60 years. But now I think for the last 20 years, even the FBI is recording all interviews, all interrogations. And someone confesses, and they somehow have to come up with a way. And these usually the defense, of course, that would hire a false confession. I'm using air quotes if you're not watching us. False confession expert. They're usually psychologists, sometimes lawyers, and they will claim that the article "the" was used instead of and that changes the whole meaning. And we don't have to. We could spend the whole episode talking about this, but I'm sure you've had some of those in the courtroom. And I've heard a few of them talk, and it's a lot of no doubt there have been some false confessions out there. No doubt at all. And whether intentionally, whether mistakenly, and you can break it down different ways, but it's also a thriving business for a lot of psychologists who they can't get billable hours anywhere else, so they go into this field.
And it's not just limited to false confession, so-called experts. I had an expert testify that a baby who suffered traumatic brain injuries, that was as a result of mold in her grandmother's house, if you can believe that. A real quick story about videotaping, because there's a law in New York State that I helped draft and get passed that when possible, all police interrogations be videotaped. So I was prosecuting a guy for murder, and he murdered his wife. Well, he was a suspect in murdering his wife, but their 7-year-old child was missing. So 2 weeks after the crime, I had him picked up on a parole violation, and he agreed to be interviewed. And during that 2 weeks and for the next subsequent 2 weeks, the entire community was searching for that little boy, James Jose Allen. We had his picture on milk cartons, public transportation. And 2 weeks before little Jimmy's body was found, this guy was interviewed for 6 hours. So on my summation, I wheeled over the videotape machine to show the jury the tape, and they rolled their eyes like, "Oh, God." I said, "Folks, I'm only going to show you 15 seconds." And you could have heard a pin drop in the courtroom. And I hit the play button. The detective looked at him and said, "What do you think about your son?" He was a very important part of my life. And I hit stop. And I looked at the jury and I said, "I can play the other 5 hours and 59 minutes, 45 seconds. You won't hear Mr. Allen stutter one other time, but he stuttered over the word was. He referred to now, if that hadn't been videotaped, I'm not sure the cop would have picked up on it because he didn't pick up on it. And in fact, nobody picked up on it until I played it on, and the jury, a 3.5 month trial, the jury took one vote and convicted the guy.
In the second case we're going to discuss, there was a very important interview that took place with the suspect in which a certain word was mispronounced,
Right.
which led to her demise. But we'll save that for a minute,
Okay.
for a few minutes. Ray, any follow-ups? I want to get into the first case of Bill that's going to discuss it with us today.
No, let's move on to the first case.
So, Bill, you told us a little bit, or told me a little bit in advance about the Juanita Hoyt case from the 1990s. I helped you with another case around 2012, but let's start with this one because I think our audience, I don't even know what adjective to use here, appreciate it. They'll appreciate the work you eventually did in resolving it, but it's a tragic and sad case. Walk us through it. 5 young children, am I correct, wound up dying?
James, Julie, Molly, and Noah.
Well,
5 children born from the same 2 parents. So I'll give you the Reader's Digest version of the history here. So I'm just kind of walking out the door of the DA's office back in the mid '80s, and a Syracuse police detective, excuse me, Frank Badzilik, he comes to see me, and he says, "Fitz, I've got this guy, Stephen Vanderslice, and he's lost 3 children, 1 here in Syracuse and 2 in another part of the state. And, the doctors are kind of hemming and hawing, but they think they might have been SIDS deaths. I think that there's something more to it."
SIDS
So,
means, of course.
sudden infant death syndrome, number 1 cause of death of children before the age of 1 year in the world. So he confesses. It's not a full-blown confession, and he doesn't confess to killing all 3 children. He just confesses to killing 2, as if we'd think bad of him if he killed 3 children, but he's okay because he only killed 2. So one of them was in my county. One of them was in a neighboring county in the Albany area. So his confession was, it wasn't airtight, but it was a confession. I did it. Yeah, and I won't go into all the details of that. So I got Mike Bodden, who's a friend of mine. I got him involved in the case, and he said we got to exhume the kids. I said, "Geez, they've been in the ground for almost a decade." So we exhumed little Heath, who was in my county, and nothing but skeletal remains, a little bit of adipose tissue, and very difficult for a forensic pathologist to corroborate because you have to corroborate a confession. Lots of crazy people say that, well, I killed mom, and you find out mom died of cancer. So when we exhumed Heather in Saratoga County, I can remember this like it was yesterday. When that casket opened up, that little baby looked like she had been embalmed a week ago, exception of her eyes. Every other, her flesh, her organ, her little nightie, perfectly preserved. Here's what had happened. A funeral director had embalmed the first baby in Syracuse. He then moves to Saratoga County, and I'm saying Saratoga, it's Schenectady County. He then moves to Schenectady County as a funeral worker. He sees this name. It's an odd name. It's a Dutch name, Vanderslice. So whatever he does, Jim and Ray, he over embalms this baby. And the reason he does it is because he's praying that someday some idiot DA is going to be trying to exhume this body, and I want to help determine the cause of death, which he did. So we were able to determine that little Heather clearly had been suffocated. There were sufficient petechial hemorrhages that were still visible in her airway. And for some reason, my former colleague, he's deceased now, decided he was going to take a manslaughter plea. And I said, that's unacceptable. This guy is a serial killer. He's got to get the max. So I hired this woman, Linda Norton. She's a pediatric forensic pathologist out of Dallas. Uh, for historical reference, she did the re-autopsy of Lee Harvey Oswald,
Oh
confirming
boy.
that it was, in fact, Lee Harvey Oswald that had been shot by Jack Ruby. So Linda and I are preparing, and she's a salt of the earth. I mean, she is a tough customer. I love her to this day. And we're preparing, and she stops, and she looks at me, and she says, "Wait a minute. I'm in Syracuse, New York." So I said, "Okay." kidding. I said, "Oh, great. I'm paying you $2,000 a day and you just figured out where you were," as a snide remark, which is typical of me. She says, "No, no, you don't understand. You have a serial killer right here in Syracuse, New York." And she tells me about this apparently world famous paper that was written for Pediatrics Magazine, which is still in publication, about a doctor in Syracuse that had studied the deaths of 5 children. So that's a pretty, intriguing thing to say to a prosecutor, that you have a serial killer here in Syracuse. So long story short, I convict Mr. Vanderslice. He goes away. He's still in the can, thank God. But for circumstances beyond my control, I left the office. And when I mentioned this to my successor, it stayed on a shelf for 5 years. So now I take office in 92. I go up about a half a mile from here to the university medical school. I go into the library and I pull out the Pediatrics Magazine from 1971. And I read this article by a guy by the name of Dr. Alfred Steinschneider, coincidentally also from Brooklyn, who is listing, he doesn't give names, he gives initials. And he lists 5 children that UH, turns out to be Juanita Hoyt, had over the course of a decade, that she had these 5 children. He studied the last 2 children, Molly and Noah. And I'm reading this, and I want to scream, and I'm in this little cubicle all by myself. Molly and Noah both lived 2.5 months, coincidentally, almost to the day. They were under Steinschneider's constant 24-hour-a-day care at the local hospital, with the exception that both of them were sent home after about a month and a half, where they seemed to be okay, and were immediately rushed to the hospital the following day because they had, quote, breathing episodes. They turned blue suddenly out of nowhere. None of this was witnessed by anyone except Juanita and
The mother.
the mother. Yeah. And I began to familiarize myself with a psychological phenomenon known as Munchausen syndrome by proxy. So Baron Munchausen was this, mythical character who made all these false claims about how great he was. So hence the name Munchausen. Basically, it's psychotic liars syndrome. And by proxy, some people will inflict pain on themselves, put cigarette burns on their hands and arms and say, look, I have lesions from AIDS, and what they essentially are sympathy junkies. Instead of heroin, what gets them high is sympathy. And if you're going to do it by proxy, well, who would your victims be? People that can't tell the story, infants or the very, very sick and elderly. And very often, these offenders have either a medical background or a fascination with medicine and so forth and so on. So I realized, wow, that to my disappointment, it turned out that the children had all been killed in Tioga County, which I don't have jurisdiction over. And it took me a long time to get the DA there on board. I'm laughing because the first call, Bob Simpson, he's retired now, but he's a very low-key guy. And I call him, I say, you don't know me. I'm Bill Fitzpatrick. I'm from Syracuse. I'm the DA in Syracuse. And you got a woman down there that killed 5 of her children. And, I'm expecting, what? Are you crazy? Yeah. Okay. Well, tell me what you got. So it took
That's low keyed. You're right. He's a low keyed guy.
yeah, he's a low key guy. Not everybody moves at the same speed I do. So it took me a while, but eventually we put together a task force. It was run by the New York State Police, which is a fantastic state agency. And I got Michael Baden involved again,
He was a forensic pathologist, right?
forensic pathologist, and we exhumed the babies, and it was a horror show. There were bones. They were all buried in a common pauper's grave. There were bones mixed up. You couldn't tell which child was which. But they were all ruled as having died from sudden infant death syndrome. And both Linda Norton and Dr. Baden said, not possible, not possible. You can have, SIDS does not run in families, but homicide does run in families. And I eventually persuaded Bob that it was time to take a shot at getting Juanita to confess. I wish it had been videotaped. I tried. Again, it wasn't my county, but I watched through a one-way window, and 2 hours of just factual data received by Linda Mulvey. She's now a senior state police investigator, and Linda was excellent in her entire, very low key, not leading questions, not feeding her anything, just tell us your story. She comes back out, and I met with her, with Bob, and I said, Linda, it's time. Tell her that we know she killed these kids. So Linda goes back in. She very gently takes Juanita's hand, and Juanita has a V-neck shirt on. She looks like she's in her 60s, and she was actually in her 40s when this interview was taking place. She was a very young mother. And you could, like a thermometer in a cartoon, you could see the blood go right up her neck. I've never seen anything like it when Linda said, we know you killed these kids. And for the next, 90 minutes, she related in excruciating detail how she killed each and every one of them. And the sad, they were all sad, but they were all beyond sad. But the one that really stood out in my mind was James, because James was 2.5. And to label any baby over 1 year who dies as a SIDS death is medical malpractice. And for 2.5, it's exponentially medical malpractice. And she said, he just ran down the hallway, jumped into my arms, and I smothered him. And it was a sensational trial. Simpson did a fantastic job. Steinschneider, the guy who treated the last two babies, he was actually afraid to come to New York because he was afraid I was going to arrest him. And he wasn't far off, because his crimes he committed in Syracuse. I decided not to arrest him, but he became a millionaire. He became a millionaire on his theory that babies who had momentary lapses of breathing, apnea, were more susceptible to dying from sudden infant death syndrome. So the solution is to put these babies on monitors. And we've all seen them. Now we have more sophisticated cameras and microphones, but this guy, sold millions of these all over America. And these terrified parents would, the kids would rip these diodes off their bodies, and the alarms would go off, and parents were up in the middle of the night rushing in. Is Johnny okay? And there wasn't a single documented case of these monitors saving a child's life, not one. And the thing I'm most proud of is that within a couple of months after Steinschneider's theory was totally debunked and Juanita was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, the New Zealand medical authorities came out with a new thing that had previously been rejected by American doctors, because American doctors were wed to Steinschneider's paper. They said, no, this SIDS runs in families, and we're going to give monitors, and if the babies have apnea, that's where the solution is going to be to solving the SIDS tragedy. But these doctors in New Zealand and Australia were saying, put your babies to sleep on their back. And they labeled it the Back to Sleep campaign. And that is now standard practice for all pediatricians that I'm aware of in America. And you know what happened? The SIDS rate in America was cut in half, not 2% or 3%, 50%. And that's a great offshoot of bringing Juanita to justice. Very, very difficult. Split the community. It's a small rural community, farming community. But we heard stories. People were telling, Juanita, she had falsely claimed she had been raped several times. She was at church at a funeral, and she passed out allegedly in the aisle of the church, and people would just walk around her. And they'd go, is this woman sick? No, it's Juanita. Just ignore her. And eventually she'd realize that no one was looking anymore, and she'd just get up and go back and sit down in her pew. It's a fascinating, and it still happens today. You still will see stories about nurses killing babies in hospitals. And if you look at the statistics, how could this one nurse be on duty when 98% of our infant mortalities are occurring? That doesn't make sense. So you have to be aware of it. And as it turned out, we opened cases all over the country, including Philadelphia. That's how I met Lynn Abraham. You guys down there had a woman who had been featured in the 40s in Life magazine. She had an odd name. It was Noe. I think it's pronounced Noe. And she lost 9 children, and they were all labeled SIDS. And Lynn prosecuted her, but she was very elderly, and I don't think Lynn got any jail time out of her, but that was not the point. She agreed to be interviewed by behavioral scientists at Quantico, and I don't know what the result of that was, whether it was helpful or not. But I mean, this nobody was trying to hide this. Steinschneider wrote his article, and there it was. And there were people like Lyndon Norton who were voices in the wilderness. They couldn't get anybody to listen to them and say, "Look, this woman killed him." But you guys know from you're experienced enough to know back in the day, oh, no, no, parents don't do that to kids. That just doesn't happen. And the same mentality of, asking a rape victim, "Well, what do you mean you had a drink with the guy? And you expect us to believe that this was a rape? Well, what were you wearing?" Things like sometimes it takes time to change attitudes to the right way of thinking.
Well, a good thing here, Bill and Jim, is that based upon this Juanita Hoyt case, it changed the way nationwide how we looked at child investigations, child homicide investigations. It really did.
It certainly did, Ray, and I'm very proud of that. Not shy to say that. Now it's completely different how we look upon it is, in fact, even in the medical guidelines, it's improper to refer to a case as a SIDS death on a death certificate unless there has been a complete and thorough police scene investigation, photographs, toxicology, a forensic autopsy. You guys both know that, I know we always focus on wrongful convictions, but we never focus about wrongful acquittals or wrongful non-arrests, that there are a lot of deaths out there, including the next case we're going to talk about, that are many times ignored because they're misdiagnosed.
Bill, was there the baby's father, baby's plural father, involved in this at all? Was it co-conspirator? Any charges at all?
No charges at all, and it would take me too long to explain.
That's fine.
I have no doubt that he had no idea what was going on. Now,
Okay.
should he have? Of course, but he was a simple guy. They actually adopted a kid. They adopted one kid. 2 weeks after the adoption, she calls social services and says, quote, "Get this thing out of here before I wring its neck." They adopted another kid after that. I don't know how in the name of God she was allowed to adopt anybody, but the father made a pact with himself and his kid. I'm never going to leave this kid alone with her. And he never did. And the kid is now an adult. And I obviously don't keep in contact with him, but I certainly hope he's doing well.
Is Juanita still alive? Still in prison?
She passed away. Can't remember when she passed away. I'm glad that she's. Maybe sounds cruel to say. I mean, I'm glad she died in prison. But when she was complaining about being sick, no one believed her, and it turns out that she actually was sick and died. That's the ultimate irony.
I bet you she didn't get along in prison very well with the other female inmates, being a
Yeah.
baby killer. A lot of women there for life that never had a chance, to get pregnant and have a child, and here she's killed five of hers. So prison may not have been that friendly for her. And yeah, I remember it was a female detective, I think, out of Orlando Police Department that came to the FBI Academy, and she's the first one I ever heard even use the term Munchausen by proxy.
Okay.
And there were videotapes. This is like in the early '90s. I think I was still working in New York as an agent. I wasn't even in the profiling unit yet, but they somehow suspected some women of doing this, usually mothers that would stay overnight in the room with their kids, and there's a pillow going over the kid's head. Then all of a sudden, nurse, nurse, you'd hear them yelling, and that's it's a bizarre complex out there. Which again, we could do a whole episode with that. But that men commit plenty of crimes. That seems to be something women do. Like you said, there's Munchausen on its own, psychotic lying. It goes by other names, but they just hurt themselves. That's one thing. If you're going to hurt someone else, and it's going to be someone that can't talk or is disabled somehow, obviously a toddler or younger, that's when these people somehow get this, this mental health fix. So it's very sad. So thanks for educating our audience about these types of cases. Let's move on to a woman who also tried to kill a daughter, a bit older. Walk us through the Stacy Castor case and how Onondaga County and your office got involved in this. And I received a phone call from you one day, and I helped you a little bit with it.
Well, you're too modest. Yeah, I reached out to you, and that's how we met. Well, I guess the case begins with Stacy Daniels. She marries a fellow by the name of Michael Wallace. Michael Wallace, kind of a wild guy, used drugs, motorcycle wannabe guy. And they get married in the late '80s, and they have a couple of kids. Ashley, the oldest, and Bree, a couple of years younger. And this changes Michael. He becomes, wow, I got two people dependent on me. I got to clean up my act, and he does. He cleans up his act. He becomes a hardworking guy. And late 1999, he starts complaining about not feeling well. He can't explain it, and he goes to see a doctor. And it's actually in the doctor's notes, which we later recovered. I feel drunk, but I haven't had any alcohol to drink. The doctor, I don't know, negligently, or I don't know, says, well, I think you have an ear infection. He prescribes him some medicine. Month later, Ashley comes home from school. Her father, Michael, is lying on the couch, apparently dead. Called 911. They rush him to the hospital. Dead on arrival. Stacy's there. Some of Michael's family is there. Let's do an autopsy. Oh, no, 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 please, no autopsy. Michael always told me if anything ever happened to him, he'd never want to be cut up after he died. I don't know who the hell has conversations like that, but that was her story. So there's no autopsy, and the death certificate lists cause of death, heart attack. Unbelievable. So now, fast forward, that was in another county in New York. She moves to Onondaga County, and she marries a guy by the name of David Castor, similar to the modified version of Mike Wallace, hardworking guy. He owns a heating company, which in Syracuse, New York, believe me, you can make a lot of money if you run a heating company. And he's also kind of an outdoorsy guy. He's got a lot of toys. He's got skidoos and skis and hunting, and he's got a shotgun under his bed. And on August 21st, which is a Monday of 2005, 911 gets a call from Stacy, now Castor, who says, my husband and I have been fighting all weekend. He's locked himself in a bedroom. I can't get in there. So you got to send somebody here. So cop gets there, tries the door, can't open the door, gets a step ladder, goes out. It's a little ranch house in suburban part of town, and he peeks through a window through the curtains, and he sees what he appears to be David lying on the bed, state of undress. He tells her this. She was sitting in a lawn chair in the driveway smoking when he got there. Doesn't seem to be too particularly concerned. He busts the door down, goes in. Michael's obviously dead, been dead for a while. There's a little bit of activity on the nightstand. There's a bottle of some kind of liquor. There's an empty cranberry juice bottle. There's two glasses. One is empty, but it's got a little grease on it. The other's got a liquid in it that looks green, about half full. He's looking around. She's now being interviewed in another part of the house and says, his father died in July. He's been really depressed. His business was tanking. He's upset with the girls because they don't clean the house and so forth and so on. So we argued that weekend. I spent Saturday night and Sunday night at my friend's house. We came over Saturday. We saw him. He was real wobbly. He didn't seem to be himself. So I put him to bed and I left. And then, as I said, spent the rest of the weekend with my girlfriend and her husband. And, there's some things that obviously don't add up just based on on the bare minimum that I told you there. But the autopsy reveals cause of death is antifreeze. Antifreeze is kind of unusual in that it is sweet to the taste. A lot of pets will die. If you put your car in the garage, it overheats, it leaks antifreeze. The pet comes out, crawls under the car and starts licking the antifreeze, and it tastes good, and they die. And the way it kills you, it takes about 3 ounces to kill a human, is when it handled by the liver, it becomes crystallized, the byproducts of the antifreeze itself. And those crystals were evident in the autopsy. The medical examiner could tell right away that the cause of death was antifreeze. coupled with her statement, medical examiner ruled it a suicide. So it doesn't really get on my radar screen at that point. Tragically, lots of people commit suicide. It's only, months later where some detectives from our sheriff's department come over to see me because the buck stops here. I'm the final arbiter. And there's a dichotomy of opinion. Suicide, other people say, no, this got to be investigated as a homicide. So you guys know me well enough at this point to know that I'm going to go, it's a homicide until somebody tells me definitively otherwise. So we began looking into it, and we find out some very, very unusual things. In the trash, about halfway down the trash, that this road detective was smart enough to look through, and it was admissible in court because he said, I was looking for a suicide note. I wasn't looking for incriminating evidence against her. She wasn't even a suspect. He finds a brand new, probably 8-inch turkey baster. It's clear that it's brand new. There's no corrosion on it at all. It's got the rubber plunger on the back. And we take that to the lab along with all of the items on the nightstand. And the scene is thoroughly documented, fingerprints, photographs, et cetera, et cetera. When the tests come back on the turkey baster, the victim's DNA is on the tip of the turkey baster, and there's a slight residual amount of antifreeze still in the bowl. On the nightstand, none of his fingerprints are on anything, but her fingerprints are on the glass with the green liquid, which turned out to be antifreeze. And the other glass as well, which had a little bit of grease on it, which may have come from David's hand because he'd come home, as you might imagine, a guy that fixes air conditioners and heating ducts might be a little bit dirty. So at that point, I'm convinced that she murdered the guy. But I certainly wouldn't suggest, based on that I have enough to convict her beyond a reasonable doubt. So we begin a long process, and most people are saying, quite frankly, that oh no, they seemed happy, everything was hunky dory between them, and not surprisingly, I'm saying, well, these two girls, their names aren't Castor. Where's their father? Well, he's dead. He died of a heart attack. Now, okay, people have multiple tragedies in the family. A heart attack, suicide doesn't translate to murder. And I started looking into, well, how did Michael die? And there's got to be more than just a death certificate. Well, it turns out that, as I said, he wasn't autopsied. It was just based on her testimony that he had been complaining about chest pains, which is total nonsense. So we begin a series of events where I know we're gonna arrest her in the next couple of weeks. So this is now we're into 07. So the first thing we do is have Michael exhumed, and I know that's going to get a reaction from her because she's going to find out about it. Somebody at the cemetery will tip her off, and sure enough, somebody did.
Again,
So
Michael is the first husband,
Michael's the first husband,
and he
never been
died
on
in 2000.
early 2000. Never been autopsied, and I get a wiretap once I find out that Michael died, guess what, of antifreeze poisoning. We don't, of course, don't release that to the public. So a couple of days later, one of the detectives at the sheriff's department, Dominic Spinelli, he is going to interview Stacy Castor. Unfortunately, it wasn't videotaped. I wish it had been, but nevertheless, it wasn't. And she tells a story similar to the story that she had told a year earlier, that, yeah, we were arguing that night. He had a couple of drinks of diet soda in the garage and we were arguing. He was very depressed about his dad. He was depressed about the business. As it turns out, the business was very profitable and had absolutely no lack of clients whatsoever. But during the conversation with Spinelli, and Spinelli made careful note of this, she would refer to antifreeze as anti-free. It was almost like a tic that she had. I don't know whether it was a speech impediment or for whatever reason. And at one point, immediately before she asserted her right to counsel, she looks at Spinelli and says, well, when I poured the the cranberry juice into his drink, at the side of the bed, and then obviously Spinelli reacted to that, and she said, I don't want to talk anymore. I want an attorney. Meanwhile, we're listening to her talk to her friends. I didn't I never get my hopes up on a wiretap, but turns out we got some very, very crucial things about the wiretap. But I remember this day like it was yesterday. It was one of the worst days of my life. It was September the 13th, 2007. We're listening to her in real time, and Stacy Castor, is calling the 911 center to say that her daughter just tried to kill herself. And it was early in the morning. I immediately got dressed, ran out to the scene, and by the grace of God, Ashley survived. That was her daughter. Ashley survived probably by 10 minutes, and phenomenal medical intervention. It turns out that when we did a toxicology on her, she had this enormous amount of liquor, barbiturates, depressants, anything that you would, throw into a hammer and pistol grind in, along with booze. Now, Stacy was interviewed and she said, yeah, she came over the day before, and we wanted to have a drink, mom and daughter. She was, just turning of age, and, we drank it. And when Ashley comes to, obviously the police ask her what happened, and she's like, I don't know what happened. I came over for a drink with my mom. It tasted lousy. Well, what about this note? Well, the Stacy was like absolutely manic about handing the cops the note when they got there. Like, she's more worried about, look, she left this note. And this is how Jim and I made acquaintance, because I sent you this note and you did a thorough, fascinating analysis of it. And you pointed out some of the obvious things. First of all, it's computer generated. There's those notations are mine, by the way. There's no writing on it. It's all generated by computer.
If you're only listening, folks, Bill is actually holding the letter up.
I'm sorry. Yeah, that's
No,
right.
that's okay.
Yeah.
And we can maybe include that on our website later. I have my own copy. So continue.
Yeah, so I called it the War and Peace of Suicide Notes. I've been to multiple suicides, as you guys have investigated, and it's usually handwritten, not always, but usually handwritten, and it's something short and sweet. I'm sorry I screwed up. I was a lousy father. I love you. Please forgive me. Bang. Something along those lines. And I was always suspicious of David committing suicide when he's got a shotgun under his bed. So a shotgun, when you pull the trigger and blow your brains out, your brain doesn't have enough time to register pain. You're dead before you know it. Antifreeze poisoning over the course of 72 hours. Oh my God, what a horrible, painful, debilitating way to kill yourself. It just didn't make any sense. So here's what Jim pointed out to me. First of all, 4 references in this note to anti-free. That's the way the author spelled it. No ZE at the end. He also pointed out that even though we had Michael Wallace, the first husband's cause of death, as antifreeze poisoning, the suicide note makes reference to him ingesting rat poison as well. Fortunately, we still had tissue samples from him after the exhumation and initial autopsy. And sure enough, when we did further toxicological tests, there was rat poison in his system. That's how committed this woman was. She also makes, as Jim pointed out, she'll spell names differently within a sentence or two. She spells David, D-A-V-I-D, and then 20 words later spells it D-A-V-E-D. So the person is obviously trying to disguise their identity, which begs the question. Your signature's on the bottom, not your signature, but your name. You put your name there, Ashley. And what I eventually convinced the judge, which was important, was, Judge, whoever wrote this note killed these 2 men. And that's the pitch that I made to the jury, because the defense was all over the place. It could have been this guy, it could have been a jilted lover, it could have been suicide, it could have been a heart attack. That's what defense lawyers are paid to do. See what, throw the spaghetti against the wall and see what sticks. But even he was convinced at the end that the person that wrote this note was the killer. And I never used Jim at trial because, in my judgment, I didn't have to. Plus, I didn't want to pay his exorbitant fee, no, that's not true at all. That's not true at all. But they brought this guy up, and he was a disaster. He said, I've looked at a bunch of.
Let me clarify. He was a linguist
Yes.
out of New York City, right? We don't have to name him, but And I know, yeah, tell us. And you left out real quick, yeah, the antifree part I picked up right away. He also, the writer of the letter, which had no punctuation, there may have been a few apostrophes, but no periods, commas, colons, exclamation points, nothing. Very weird, very odd. And he, the writer also of this document, one solid page, top to bottom, starts mommy and ended Ashley, but there was a weird misuse of a pronoun in there. And I know that's where you're going with your cross examination. Instead of I did it,
It
as
did.
Ashley would say, it did it. So it's a little tough if you don't have the document in front of you, but I know this was a key to your cross examination.
Yeah,
Continue.
and again, your brilliance in pointing this out. So what the will not name him, what the expert, quote unquote, from New York City used was a slew of handwritten notes that Ashley had written to her boyfriend. Nothing in there other than teenage gibberish,
And they were the known documents, as we call them
known documents,
in the
her
parlance, known
handwriting,
writings of Ashley.
no question about it. He then took 4 or 5 business letters dictated by or that purported to have been produced by Stacy Castor, and this expert says in Ashley's handwritten notes, there's a number of misspellings, punctuation marks are out of place, so forth and so on. Stacy Castor's letters are precise, everything's spelled correctly, and, you guys are probably laughing already. I mean, I looked at the guy and I said, "Excuse me, are you familiar with spell check? I mean, is that ever across your mind?" So if she says, "Your cat scratched me," and writes KAT, it's gonna come out CAT, isn't it? So that doesn't mean, and then I surprised him with 3 handwritten letters that a friend of Stacy had delivered to me just by accident shortly before trial. She says, "Oh, by the way, she's been writing me from jail. Would you like the letters?" I said, "Oh, absolutely." And here's the thing that Jim found. In one of the letters, she's protesting to her friend that she's innocent and that, we made her a deal, which isn't true. We didn't make her any offer. And she says, "I'm going to get out on bail and I'm going to beat this because it didn't do it." So I read that, pointed it out to Jim, and he pointed it out to me in more useful terms. It stuck in my mind. I said, somewhere, somehow, that's going to become important. And remembering then from the suicide note, she says here, "It was harder than with Daddy because you were always home or with him, but it did it." Obviously, meaning to say, I did it.
And
And
but let's make it clear, real up here
yeah,
front here. Not only is this a purported suicide note by the 19-year-old daughter Ashley, but in this note she also, again air quotes, confessed to killing her biological dad when she would have been what, 12 years old,
12 years old,
and then also killing her stepdad when I don't know at this point maybe 17 or so. And
17.
so, and which conveniently exonerates mom slash Stacy, and especially if her daughter actually dies from this once again poisoning by this black widow. We'll call her that now. So I just wanted to get that perspective in for our audience at this point to make sure they're clear on that.
Yeah. But it was a fascinating, I can use the word tick, right,
Yes.
Jim? Yeah. That,
Pronoun substitution, third person singular for what should have been first person singular. It
yeah,
for I,
yeah.
twice
And
in
yeah.
the alleged suicide letter and her letter to her friend whose name begins with an L.
And these are the things that you and I discussed which is why I reached out to you in the first place, which are fascinating to me. And I don't know, we may have even talked about the Hauptmann ransom notes back then, because Hauptmann had a tick of adding an E to letters that did not have an E in the English language. So when I cross-examined him
The
with the
expert, the linguistic expert.
with the ammunition that you gave me, I looked at my co-counsel and she says, "You don't need to fly Jim Fitzgerald in for this trial. That guy was toast." It was embarrassing. It was embarrassing.
Well, may I just add a little bit to that?
Sure.
And you told me this before, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, because I've been teaching this case for a dozen years since I first worked it with you. And I'll just summarize it. I always use it. If you remember the old TV show Columbo, because I believe this is how you explained it to me. One last question, sir, as he's walking out the door. And this guy was about this expert linguist out of New York. This may have been the only forensic linguist case he ever did. And we don't have to name him after all these years, whatever. But just as you were ready to end his cross examination, he said, "Oh, by the way, let me show you the purported suicide letter again, and look at line whatever it was, 27." And he goes, "Can you read that aloud? You know, blah blah blah. It didn't do it." And from what I remember you saying, I thought you kind of went, "That's unusual." Yeah, it should be I. Have you ever seen that before? No. Yeah, but then you showed him the letter from the woman who begins with L, that Stacy was writing from prison, and as you just mentioned, there it is again. And you confronted him with both examples, which he didn't bring up in his report, he didn't bring up in his testimony, direct or now cross, and he was kind of stuck. And you said, "Do you stick by your opinion?" And I guess as a paid expert, well, yes. So is that close to what you remembered happening?
That's exactly what
Yeah.
happened.
Okay.
You got a great memory, Jim. And I might point out that Peter Falk, who played Columbo, is also an SU graduate. So that's that's where I came
It
up
all
with that
ties
idea.
together there. So,
No, it was one of those great, moments in court that
and
you
I know
you
we're winding up here, but I also want to say you and I went back and forth. Remember, it was a big snowstorm that weekend, but I was willing to come up to Syracuse. But when you described that testimony, and more important, under direct, I should say, when you're presenting the case under direct, you brought up Ashley Wallace, the 19, she may have been older at that point, 21 or so. And her testimony, it used to be because the case was in fact recorded live by some local news channel. The judge permitted that. And I remember watching the video of Ashley testifying. And I said, "Hey, I'm a forensic linguist. I can come up and testify." There's no testimony better than Ashley up there on the stand during that trial saying, "First of all, I was forced to drink this stuff. My mom said, 'Oh, hold your nose while you're doing it and you'll like it better.'" And then she also said, "I didn't write this letter. The detective asked me at the hospital." I said, "What letter are you talking about?" And tears are coming down her face, looking at the woman at the table diagonal from her who tried to kill her, and now she knows is on trial for killing at least one husband. I know the other one was a different county, and that one got held off, I believe. But that's the bizarre part. I'm not sure that video is still out there, but if you look up Stacy Castor case and if the video from that trial, I still present it when I have the time in different cases. But this was an amazing trial. And I remember you called me and said you looked at the jury when you that last Columbo-like question to the defense linguist, and you could tell them the way they were looking. You know juries by now, and certainly then. And you said, "I don't think I need Fitzgerald as I guess, rebuttal witness. I would have been, but it's an amazing case." Ray, you're not involved in it. Are there any questions that
No,
you
that
have
was
that
one of
maybe
my
we missed?
questions. That was one of my questions to you, Bill. I was wondering what was the reaction of the jury once this team came full circle and they realized, number one, that this woman was sacrificing her daughter, and number two, that they saw the deception that was weaved throughout this whole thing. What was their reaction to that? I'd love to know.
the jury was great. It was, 9 of them. I forget what news show it was, 2020 or somebody, Dateline. Somebody did a thing on it, and 9 of them agreed to be interviewed, which I always hold my breath, like, "Oh God, don't say something that's gonna ruin the case." But they were great. They deliberated 2 days, which, everybody was panicking. "Oh my God." I said, "Relax, relax. There's a lot of, this is a long trial and a lot of evidence." They took 1 vote, and they were good. I spoke to several of them afterwards. They, with all due respect to this, character from New York, they had no, that wasn't even discussed. The points that Jim armed me with were a very high level of discussion.
It's a Go ahead, Ray, if you're going to.
No, I'm good. I'm good.
It's a fascinating case, and it really forensic linguistics. And I wasn't brought in. The trial had already started when I was brought in. We had a mutual friend who was an FBI agent who recommended me to you, and I always appreciate her doing that. And I was glad. Just a few phone calls. We talked on the phone. I helped you a little bit with cross examination, but you obviously had the skill set already. So the Black Widow was convicted. What was her sentence? 50 years plus something?
Yeah, 51 years. She was not sentenced for anything to do with, Michael, because that was another county.
Right.
The DA out there decided, I think properly, not to pursue that case. So she got 25 to life for killing David, 25 years definite for attempting to kill Ashley, and then she got an additional couple of years for falsifying David's will, which gave basically everything to her. So 51 to life turned out to be irrelevant because on June 11th of 2016, she died of a heart attack at Bedford Hills. When I was told that initially by, I have a, as you might imagine, a macabre sense of humor, if you can even call it that. I said, "Are you sure she died of a heart attack? She doesn't have a heart." So they said, "No, no, she died of a heart attack." And coincidentally, the day before, her final appeal had been denied. So to this day, I think she popped some. She had some pills for some medical condition. I think she killed herself.
Can you imagine knowing I guess the adopted parent wouldn't matter either, but your biological parent tried to kill you? And not just like a quick flip of the switch and then punched you because they were angry. This was a pre-planned, pre-arranged mixing of the drink, writing of this note, this bizarre note, and misspelling. And it was an unusual case from a linguistic perspective, of comparing written language to spoken language. And I know that Detective was it Dinelli who testified. It would have been nice to have that recorded, but the video was there of him testifying, and he was so clear, and he didn't say the word first. She just volunteered antifree, maybe even more than once in his interview, and he just kind of wrote it down. He didn't correct her, and then all of a sudden this note shows up, and this word is spelled the same way as she pronounced it. And I let you know that there is, in linguistic world, you can compare written to spoken language, and that's what we basically did. So my opinion was to you that Stacy Castor did write the alleged suicide note, and I gave a separate opinion. Ashley Wallace did not. So I rendered two opinions, and the expert the defense called had the exact opposite. Stacy Castor did not write it. Ashley Wallace did. Nothing's funny about this, but it's just bizarre how, and it was so clear to me. And I think that may have been the one. He was one and done in terms of testifying in court after that case, because
In Westlaw since then. Yeah.
DA Colombo here did a job on him.
Bill, I have to ask you a question. You've prosecuted murderers, child killers, serial offenders, cold cases. What case or cases have changed you the most as a person?
Well, certainly this one. I still keep in touch with Ashley and Bree. I love both of them. I promised that I'm going to walk Ashley down the aisle when she gets married, and her boyfriend of several years hasn't still popped the question yet, but that's a little discussion that he and I will have in the future. Bree has divorced, and she has a couple of absolutely gorgeous kids. And we have lunch a couple of times a year and just keep in touch. If they need some fatherly advice, they know that I'm here for them. They're beautiful, beautiful young women.
Despite their mother trying to kill them.
Yeah, hard to believe because I have three kids.
Or at least kill Ashley anyway. Yeah.
I have three kids, but when we were trying to conceive, after we had gotten financially stable enough where my wife and I thought it was time to start raising a family, we encountered some difficulties that required an operation to my wife. I mean, that's how dedicated she was to wanting to have children, and she would do anything for them. And there's nothing more certain than a mother's love for a child, except that wasn't the case with Stacy. But all the cases, Ray, I've got a desk drawer over here. I've got a couple hundred letters in there from people. Sometimes I've had to tell families that we discovered the body. Like I remember one family, their daughter was missing, and we all in law enforcement suspected the worst. And sure enough, we found her body in a marsh. And I had to tell them there was a surviving sister. And I said, I want to do something for her. And she loves the New York Yankees. Okay. I called a couple of buddies, Bob Morgenthau, friend of mine, used to be the DA in Staten Island, Danny Donovan. We get, on field, and I got pictures, and I cry when I look at that because she wrote on her Facebook page. Now this, mind you, she's just lost her sister. This was the happiest day of my life, and that's why Ray and Jim. That's why we do what we do. We don't do it for the money, obviously. Look at the way the three of us are dressed. We look like a couple of guys that just left.
I'm wearing my best gym shorts.
All right, but we do it because it's in our DNA and we love it, and we only shave one face in the morning, and I wouldn't trade I don't work. I haven't worked in 40 years.
Saying that, is there that one case that you still think about
Yeah,
today that
there's
remains
some.
unsolved?
Yeah, there's one which it was a non-jury case. I had 10 jurors, and then the defense, for some reason, decided they wanted to go non-jury, and the guy was acquitted by a judge. It was a murder case up north where the defendant strangled a 12-year-old little boy because he objected to him dating his mother. And man, what a great case I had! And it's the only case in the United States of America where a judge threw out DNA evidence, to my astonishment. And in New York, you can't appeal intermediate orders. You have to have a final disposition before you can appeal. So I couldn't appeal. The kid had his DNA under his fingernails, and the judge threw it out, wound up acquitting the guy. But that case will haunt me till I die. But he'll get his.
I have one final question that I want to ask, and then I'll turn it back to Jim. If you could sit down today with a young prosecutor who first walked into the county district attorney's office in 1975, what advice would you give him?
Do the right thing every time, every single time, especially when nobody's watching. You never know when you have people's lives in your hands. To you, it's never routine. If you're quote unquote burned out, go somewhere else. Go chase ambulances. Don't ever get burned out. This is the most important thing that's ever happened to these people. To lose a child, to lose a loved one, a husband, a grandmother, whatever it is, somebody that you love. And don't ever use the word closure with me. It's a stupid word. There's no closure when that table has one empty chair added at Thanksgiving, on birthdays and holidays. We only get 70, 80, 90 years if we're very lucky on this planet. And to lose someone and have that ache in your body, they need a champion, and that's your job. You are to be their champion. And it is, the final thing I'd say to him or her is, it is just as exhilarating to exonerate an innocent person as it is to convict a guilty person.
Well stated. Well stated.
I'm not sure if you have anything you want to mention for people to look things up. I know you're running for office again. You said the last time in about a year and a half, folks. If you're in
Yep.
Onondaga County,
Yep.
And if I lived there, as I said earlier, I would definitely vote for you. And Ray, I bet you would too.
You get 2 votes there, Bill.
Hey, this is New York. I'll get you guys ballots. Don't worry about it.
He's only kidding if you're listening, Governor Hochul or Mandami or whomever. So now this has been great, Bill. Thank you for your time here. Again, you are a sitting DA. You're running an office with at least 50 other prosecutors, probably 50 other employees at least on top of that. So you're a busy guy, and thank you for coming on Cold Red. With all the other stories you have, maybe we can bring you back some other time.
It's a great honor to be back with 2 All-Stars. You guys are the best.
Well, there was 3 All-Stars on the screen today. So everybody, thanks for listening or watching this episode of Cold Red. Please like and subscribe us. We're at coldredpodcast.com, all the regular sites out there. And thanks to Matt McDonald for being our producers, and also Rick Schilling for, in fact, being our music coordinator. And everybody, again, thanks for listening, watching, and we'll see you next time on Cold Red.